As he mentioned, my name is Chris Dixon. I am an activist, a writer. I lived on the US West Coast for a really long time, was deeply involved in a lot of organizing work out there. These days I live in Sudbury, Ontario, Atikamekw, Anishinaabe territory, north of here, and that's where I live and struggle at the moment. I'm also a recent graduate student. I finished a PhD just this last spring. I went to graduate school very opportunistically, and I'll tell you more about that. What I did in graduate school, I went to graduate school so that I could pursue a project of traveling around and interviewing anti-authoritarian organizers involved in different forms of broader-based organizing to try and really advance the key questions that I think we need to be talking about right now, try and get those reflections out. And hopefully, if all goes well, this will soon, or not before too long, will be a book called Against and Beyond. So what I'm going to say today primarily comes out of my experience over the last several years doing that research, struggling with that research, and I'll see if I can offer some insights based on that. But before I get into that, let me just ask one question, which is, how many people here are currently working or studying in university contexts? Okay, that's good. That's pretty much what I was expecting, and that's what I'm going to try and speak to in my comments here. And is everyone back there, you're able to hear me okay now? Great. So
back there need to sit down.
There's one chair here.
Okay, so in my time here today, which is quite limited, I'm actually just going to try and make a couple of really basic points, but there are points about things that I think we talk about far too little in university context, especially in explicit, collective ways. I'm trying to open up some space to do that today. And I think that we're all, in many ways, going to be speaking to some of these kinds of questions. In particular, I want to try and provoke us to think about our research, our activities of studying and writing, and who they're accountable to, and how exactly they're accountable. In other words, I want to encourage us to talk openly about who evaluates and validates our work. And I'm going to start by talking about what I think of as the conventional form of accountability that happens in university contexts. Then I'm going to talk about what I think of as a kind of alternative form of accountability that I think we should be trying to develop, that I think of as a movement-based accountability. And I'm going to conclude by talking about three of the big questions that I think this opens up for us to think about. Does it make sense? You following me? Okay. So, to begin, let me ask you just a few more questions to kind of get a sense of your own experience. So how many people here have had to use particular language, concepts, or citations to get a good grade in a class, to get a paper published in a journal, to get tenure at a university? Okay. How many here have had to choose or frame a research project in a particular way in order to get approval from a professor, a department, academic journal, or a tenure committee? Okay. How many people here have worried about whether your research work will enable you to get a university degree, an academic job, or tenure? Okay. So those are really concrete examples of how accountability works in universities, right? That's the kind of force, norm, expectation that happens in academic context that makes us work in particular ways. And I could go into lots more examples. I'm sure we could all share lots of personal stories about how this kind of accountability gets enforced in our classrooms, in our all kinds of committees that happen on campuses, in our relationships with administrations, with academic journals, etc. The key point here really is that academic structures and norms guide us toward a felt sense of accountability, primarily to other professional scholars. And I think of all of those kinds of examples that we just talked about as mechanisms, concrete mechanisms of accountability that are formalized. And I think these kinds of mechanisms actually create really big problems for those of us who are interested not only in researching movements and social justice, but actually contributing to movements and social justice. And I'm sure that we could talk about many of what those problems are. I'm not going to actually go into them in depth. Instead, what I want to do is talk about an alternative. And that's if we choose to work in university contexts, like many of us currently are in one way or another working in university contexts, I think that we can see that there aren't easy solutions for navigating around these very conventional forms of accountability. But I think there is one part of a solution that we should at least try and move toward, and that's toward cultivating what I'm talking about as movement-based accountability, a different way of relating to our work and thinking about who our work is relating to. In abstract terms, I think about movement-based accountability as something that can orient our attention, our commitments, and actually our activities of research, of writing, of doing work. And I think actually that when people in university contexts think of ourselves as responsible to movements in some way, as accountable to movements in some way, this alters how we formulate questions, how we interact with other folks who are involved in movements, how we write, how we share our work, and actually how we identify ourselves and understand our own identities. And I think right now we don't actually have a lot of formal mechanisms for creating this kind of movement-based accountability in research work in university context. I think that's why so many of those other kinds of accountability mechanisms that we talked about happen so smoothly and so easily and structure our lives. I am really happy that there is, and there does seem to be more conversation lately about things like militant research, co-research, movement-based research, but I think that's still happening in really small pockets around North America. So for one thing, I think we actually should be looking to experiences of people who are trying to formulate concrete alternatives. And for that reason, I'm actually really excited to hear from our friends here, talking about their Autonomous Research Collective. And I think there's also some really useful lessons to learn from the Team Colors Collective that's in the United States that just recently put out a very interesting book collection. So those are just some small experiments right now, collective experiments at trying to do research in accountable ways to movements. I think we need to actually be building and experimenting with all sorts of new structures. And part of our conversation today is to try and get us moving and thinking in those directions. Now I think if we're going to do this well, if we're actually going to try and develop some ways of doing research that are accountable to movements, we're going to face some really big practical questions. Probably some of them are already coming up in your minds. Now I want to briefly highlight three, because I don't have a lot of time. But I think these three questions can maybe help us with thinking about moving toward the kinds of alternatives that we need. So I'll list the question and then just say a little bit about each one. The first question is, how do we determine what we research? I think this is actually a useful thing to think about. Mike D., who is an organizer with OCAP here in Toronto, once said to me that he gets really tired of academics approaching OCAP and saying, can we research you? And never asking OCAP, what kind of research would be useful to you? And he gave me some interesting examples that we can talk about more later. But that was a profound point for me when he said that. And it's a common criticism, actually. When I've gone around and talked with all sorts of community-based organizations, movement organizations all over North America, they frequently say the same thing. We've got a slew of academics coming in to research us, to basically publish a new article in an academic journal or write a dissertation or whatever. They never actually ask us if this is in any way helpful to them. And in fact, in university contexts, we're accustomed to choosing and framing our research activities based on academic expectations, right? Like the ones that we talked about. I think what we needed to do is develop mechanisms for choosing and framing research activities based on movement needs and actually paying attention to movement expectations. Now there's a lot of complications in me bringing up that point, a lot of complications in even trying to assess what movement needs and expectations are, but I think that we actually have to begin grappling with that.